Okay, good morning. Time now, a minute after 8 a.m. On Friday, November 18th, 2022, in Japan Standard Time. Welcome back to another edition of the World Bank online morning seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize a series of online morning seminars to introduce the latest edition of the World Bank's report presented by the World Bank's expert and economist. Every spring and fall, we feature the regional economic update put together by the respective regional chief economist offices. This morning, we are going to feature the Middle East and North Africa regional update, October 2022 edition, which was released about a month ago. Connecting from Washington, we have two economists who actually are the authors of this report. We have Ernest Sergenti, who is a senior economist in the Chief Economist Office for Middle East and North Africa region of the World Bank. And also we do have Hoda Assem, who is the consultant economist in the same Chief Economist Office for the Middle East and North Africa region. For the next 30-40 minutes, we are going to listen to their presentation to share the main point of the MENA regional update, October 2022 edition, a new state of mind. In fact, the team is going to feature the first part of the report, which is about the economic outlook of the region. And after that, we'll open up a floor by myself reading the question that we received from the audience. And if you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, as usual, please send your question by using the online form posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. For your reference, right after this, I'll post the link for the report on the YouTube chat screen so that you might be able to also refer to the report itself while you have already access to the presentation, which has been posted on the announcement page of the seminar. With that, I would like to ask Ernesto and Hoda to come in to start the presentation. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Koichi. Thanks for inviting us. Thanks, everyone, for joining. As Koichi mentioned, we're going to present the part one, the macro update section of the MENA economic update that we publish every 6 months. The second part is also very interesting, so we would encourage you to download the report and look at that. There's a lot on governance, on transparency, and accountability. My co-author Hoda SM is also here. She also has a chapter in the second part on accountability, which I highly recommend as well. So today we'll focus on macroeconomic developments, as each report has a special section on that. We also have a little bit more in depth this time on inflation and debt. Okay, let me see if I see. Okay, hopefully you see now we have the key messages for this update. And so the first thing we'll discuss is sort of the transition in the global economy from a period of low inflation and low interest rates that have persisted for many years to a new period that we're entering now of higher inflation and higher interest rates. And so we also want to highlight sort of the vulnerabilities for MENA countries. So obviously from also higher inflation, although we'll show that it's not as high as in other places. A two-track growth trajectory with the oil exporters, especially the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, having a very high level of growth, especially for this year, due to the higher prices for oil and gas, as opposed to what we call the oil importer countries, those that do not export significant quantities of oil or gas, will have more vulnerabilities. One of these is sort of higher debt levels, and with the higher interest rate environment, will have a more difficult time to service their debts. And also there's still the lingering effects of COVID-19 and always a risk of future variants. Okay, and so two aspects of the report that we like to highlight are that while inflation is higher than before, in many countries it's lower than expected, and that's because of product market interventions, and we'll go into that later. And these product market interventions, how don't come free. You have to they have to pay, and so there's fiscal cost, and so something we'll discuss about whether they're the best use of government's revenues, as opposed to sort of targeted cash transfers, and especially for countries with a limited fiscal space, sort of like many of the oil importers. As a second key aspect mentions that there are vulnerabilities with rising debt vulnerabilities for those countries. Okay, so now, without any information, any extra intro, I'll start. Hopefully you can see the screen. Please let me know. It says volatility, commodity markets. And so this is more on the, as the top of the screen mentions, we're talking here more on a presentation of the global economic trends. And as we saw already beginning in the second half of 2021, sort of commodity prices started to increase. And this was accelerated after the start of the Ukraine war. And so we can see on the left-hand side, hydrocarbon prices. So for oil, gas, and coal. So the oil is in blue, gas in orange, and coal in gray. And we can see that the sharp increase in during the spring, especially of gas, although gas has come down somewhat since then. They're still higher than they were in the beginning of 2021 and in the beginning of this time period in 2019. On the right side, we present the cereal grain prices. And so as we can see that besides rice, most of these have increased. So it's an interesting topic in other countries that I've covered that rice prices haven't increased. And so that hasn't been a problem for food security. For example, say in West Africa, Senegal is more a consumer of rice. But for our countries, we'll see that they consume a lot more wheat and maize and corn. And so as you can see, as these commodities come from Ukraine, Ukraine is actually was a large corn exporter, and both Russia and Ukraine are as we've been seeing, wheat exporters and fertilizer exporters. So the start of the conflict had a detrimental effect. Well, it depends on your perspective, but for most buyers of these commodities, it was a huge increase in prices, and which has led to issues as we've been seeing of food security. Next slide. So here we're going to discuss. So here you'll see throughout the presentation, we're going to compare MENA, Middle East and North Africa. That's what I mean by MENA. MENA inflation rates with inflation rates in the United States and Europe, which we will sort of use as a proxy for global inflation, because you can see they're actually quite similar, although maybe there's more of a divergence in recent times. As we've been tracking that, as energy prices, as food prices, fertilizer prices have increased, this has pushed inflation in the advanced economies. And so we can see, especially the United States peaked at around above 9% year-over-year inflation in the summer, whereas the euro area actually appears to be continuing to increase and above 10%. Just a small note, as you can see, that we decompose the sort of headline inflation into food, which is an orange, gray, and it's the energy. It's represented by energy prices, and the yellow is the core. And one thing to note is you can see the major impact that energy prices in Europe is having on headline inflation in Europe. So why is this important? So let me see if I can do this. Yes. This is important because it's forcing or encouraging, or I would say forcing central banks to in the advanced economies to raise interest rates. And so you can see on the bottom left chart, we show the sort of hikes and loosening of interest rates in G20 by G20 central banks. And as you can see that starting in late 2021 and continuing into this year, that central banks have raised rates, have started raising rates and continuing to raise rates. And we've seen sort of, I think, 5 rate rises by the United States Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank also raised rates, both of whom raised rates in the last 2 weeks, again, by another 0.75%. So this obviously translates into higher rates for emerging market and developing economy debt, for many mechanisms, but one is the most obvious. If you can get a better return in Europe or the United States, money flows out of the country and into to the United States, and in order to sort of get the same, for investors to invest in emerging market debt, they'll need a higher return then. This also these movements can also trigger deflations of currencies, especially for the energy importers. And here I think I've missed a slide. I apologize, but that's okay. I'll just mention there's a little problem with the PowerPoint, unfortunately. But the next slide was on sort of oil prices, and so we just wanted to show sort of the trend in the futures markets, and also another graph. You can see this in the report that shows that sort of the vulnerability of MENA countries to food prices. As I mentioned before, you can see sort of the maize and wheat price, sort of the imports, especially by the oil importers and Yemen. That Yemen actually has the highest sort of percentage GDP of wheat imports that it relies on. Like I was saying, a lot of these were coming from Ukraine and Russia, and maize as well. So we just wanted to, with a slide, it was just to show that we have an increase in oil prices that are benefiting, for example, the GCC countries, and whereas sort of an increase in food prices that we showed you a few slides back that are hurting sort of most all countries, but in particular the poorer and the oil importers. If I could take a step back, I just if it's not clear, I just wanted to mention. So we'd like to divide MENA into sort of by economic structure into 2 or 3 main categories, and so the oil exporter countries are the ones where sort of a greater percentage of their exports are oil, and so these countries have benefited from this rise in hydrocarbon prices. Within that group, we have the developing countries, developing oil exporters like Algeria, Libya, Iran, Iraq. But then we have another group that are also oil exporters, but are wealthier, and that's the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the GCC countries, the Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar. So I just wanted to make sure that's clear. And the rest is, so if you're not, Egypt, for example, also exports some hydrocarbons, but it has a more diversified economy. It also exports other products like agriculture products and cotton products. And so it's not included in that category. So Egypt, for example, will be included in the oil importing. We call it oil importing countries. So you can think of them as not oil exporting. And I wanted to make sure that was clear, because in this slide here that we show, you can see the sort of this is based on our World Bank forecast. You can see over from the periods from 2020 to 2021, 2022 forecast, and 2023. So the different colors represent different years. And obviously you see everything is down in 2020. Then you have a rebound in 2021. But the thing I like to focus on is the gray bar, and you can see that the forecast for GCC growth is over 6% in the MENA countries. Actually, excuse me, in the GCC countries, it's at 6.9%, and that's driving. You can see that's the second. I don't know if I can point, but if I could, it's the sort of the second column there, and that's the driver of the MENA increase. So you see the MENA is increasing by 5.5%. That's the forecast. This is the forecast from our country economists from last month, as Kochi said, and so that forecast of 5.5%, which is the highest since 2016, is driven by the oil exporting countries, both the GCC and the developing oil exporters. And so just to give you an idea, something like I think Saudi Arabia has an 8.3% rate of growth that is forecast for 2022. Next group is the you can see in the developing oil exporters is right next to the GCC countries. They also have a higher growth rate for 2022. It's more of a mix because there also includes countries like Iran, who haven't benefited as much due to sanctions, but Iraq, who I think has a growth rate we forecast of around 8.2%. So a bit of a variety in that group. And then the last group is the developing oil importers. And this includes countries sort of like Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, which have a decent level of growth at around 4%. But we want to highlight that there's a difference, and this will be important in poverty estimates that I'll present in a few minutes, that as Egypt presents the growth statistics for its fiscal year, that is from July to June, the number we have for 2022 is actually a lot of that represents information before the conflict, the sort of the crisis that was least with the conflict in Ukraine, and so that's why we have another panel on the right to adjust for the Egyptian fiscal year, and there we can see where we use the 2023 forecast for 2022, and you can see that it lowers. If you look at the far right, you'll see the gray bar is a little lower there. I think around 3.5%, because Egyptian growth is forecast to be lower because of the crisis. And then just you can see with the yellow bars that growth will actually slow, obviously, because we had the oil growth spurt this year. Even if prices stay high, you don't have that same effect, and so growth will slow to around 3.5% for MENA as a whole. Okay, and that what I showed you before was the forecast from the World Bank forecast. We also present forecasts from the private sector, and what we wanted to show here is we have sort of like the World Bank, our country analysts just produce forecasts every 6 months, but to get an idea of the change, the rapid changes in the forecast, maybe if you could look to the right side. In the interest of time, I will focus on the right side. So you can see the change in forecast relative to February 2022 forecast. You can see the huge increase in growth forecasts for the GCC countries. Those are the orange. Whereas the oil importing countries such as Morocco, Egypt, you see that their growth forecasts were revised downwards as time went on, and so this is something that we discuss in the report, that the sort of bifurcation of the region, with those that have high oil exports benefiting the most from this current situation, and obviously the countries like Morocco and Tunisia, who rely more on trade with Europe and less on exports of oil and gas, sort of not benefiting and actually having to see their growth rates decline because of having to pay for higher oil or gas, and also for food commodities, as we showed before. So next, that's sort of just to give an aperçu or sort of a global view of the growth trends that we at the bank we're analyzing. Now I'd like to turn to the sort of the first of our in-depth analyses. This one is on inflation, and the first comment, you won't see it so much in this slide, but in future slides, I hope to show you that convince you that inflation is lower in MENA than we would expect it to be. And so this slide just what we do here, and you'll see we'll do it in the following slides as well, is we break up the inflation into 2 4-month periods. I hope you can see it's a little small. So the blue bars represent the average year-over-year inflation rates from October to February. I guess October, November, so more like a 5-month period. October 2021 to February 2022. So this is the period before the start of the Ukraine war. And the orange bars in this graph, the colors will change depending on the graph, will represent the year-over-year, average year-over-year inflation in the period subsequent to the start of the war in Ukraine, which is basically taken as around February 24th. So this goes from March, April, May, June, July, so another 5 months. So that period of 5 months after the start of the Ukraine war. I also like to say that we have Iran and Lebanon on the right side. You see we have a dashed line there. These countries were suffering from high inflation even before the start of the hostilities. So for most of the analysis, we don't really include Iran and Lebanon because it's you don't see this change because they were already suffering from hyperinflation. As you can see here, Iran was around 38% and Lebanon was above 200%. The thing that I like to highlight here is the red line. You see 8.6%. So that was the head flight inflation in the United States between March 2022 and July 2022. And you can see that although most MENA countries saw their inflation rates increase, after the start of the Ukraine war, their levels are still quite below the United States and the European level, as I showed you before, and so so that's an interesting question, and it's something we want to discuss a little bit more. I'm going to present a framework to highlight where we think that's coming from, sort of more like product market interventions, subsidies, and price controls that many countries are implementing. There are, though, you'll notice Algeria and Egypt, which have inflation in the subsequent period higher than than Europe and the United States. But you'll see that once we remove exchange rate parts of the inflation, that actually they're sort of exchange rate adjusted inflation rates are lower than what we would expect. Let me present. So that's just as an intro, and then just a little bit of math. So the framework we use is to think of the price level. This is the CPI in the United States and in many other countries as a sort of so that's P, as a weighted average between tradable prices and non-tradable prices. So tradable prices are it could be like oil or gas or clothing or manufactured goods. The products that are traded among countries that you can import and export. Whereas non-tradable goods you can think are actually more like services, sort of haircuts is the quintessential example, or doctor visits, although that might change in the future. But so haircuts I think is a good example of something that that's not it's not tradable, and so we're going to focus on the sort of tradable component, and for that we need to have the weight And so you see the A there. So what's the weight of tradables in a country's sort of consumer basket? And if I like to move forward here, I'm just going to move quick. I hope you can see the slides here with the tradable consumption shares. And so this varies by country. Here we have in the appendix, you can see where we give the calculations of how we've come across been able to calculate the sort of weight of tradables in a country's consumption basket. And you can see 50% is a good rough estimate. It depends more. Richer countries, you would expect to have a lower level of tradables, that they would sort of spend more on services. We'll see below that many poorer countries, poorer households will spend more on energy and food, which are tradables. That becomes their sort of main consumption. And that's why it's poorer countries tend to have a higher average sort of a higher tradable consumption share in their total consumption. Just to highlight that the blue the countries that with blue bars, these are countries for which we had a sufficient amount of data to be able to calculate the weight, the tradables weight, without sort of making assumptions. Whereas for other countries, for the ones in orange, we needed to do some manipulations. And for countries sort of the conflict countries such as Syria and Yemen, I think we don't have we weren't able to make the calculation. So this is sort of that. So I just wanted to show that was just the alpha there, and then what we're looking at. We want to look at inflation, because what is inflation? Inflation is actually the change in the price level, and so here we have the sort of relative change, and as a formula, we're going to assume that the non-tradables inflation is zero, and so that will remove the sort of the right hand part of the equation of the formula in equation one. And so if we take the differential and divide by p, and then we make some manipulations, we get the following formula in two, and that also includes the sort of the component, the price of the tradable price. And I apologize, but this is in the appendix of the book. You can look there. It would have been nice to show, but you can kind of see how the components of the tradable price, and that's the PT star, which is the sort of the global tradable price. So you can think of it as the dollar price, or sort of like how much a good, an import good costs in US dollars. And that you have to multiply that by the exchange rate. So if you want to buy it in Egypt, you have to buy it in pounds. So then you have to look if there's a change, if there's an increase in sort of like an appreciation of the US dollar. So that means you'd have to pay more in pounds for the commodity. And we've seen that actually with the rise in interest rates in the United States, that the dollar has strengthened against most currencies. And so the amount that if you have a flexible currency, you have to pay more. And so you can see, so that's the second component. The third component is something we're gonna focus on later, is a sort of product market pricing policy interventions. That's the 1 plus N. So you can think of it as I think that comes from the trade literature, whereas you can think of it as a sort of a tariff. But here it's actually going to be negative and bring the prices down, because sort of a subsidy or price control will have the effect of lowering the price. And so we can think of the sort of the tradable price, like food or energy in a MENA country, as being made up of the global tradable price, that's the PT star, the movements in the exchange rate, just the change actually in the price, and the movements in new sort of policy measures taken by governments. And so let me see if I can move this down. So then I'm going to focus on equation 3, and we'll come back for equation 4. So just to say, if we do a little math, what will be the effect if we remove the exchange rate. And there we would be left with sort of the global price plus the sort of policy measures taken by governments. And so this plot is one where we adjust. If you might recall, I was mentioning that we see that when Egypt and Algeria had high inflation in the second period. That's the orange bars there. But if we remove the exchange rate effect, we see, let's focus on Egypt. We see that instead of around 14% in the second period, the inflation rate, the average inflation rate actually falls to around 5.5%. So you can see the big difference between that rate and the rate in the United States, which was 8.6%. So why? What's the difference there? How come? It should be, and theoretically, it should be the same as we take the United States rate as the sort of proxy for that PT star rate I was showing before. And so you would expect that Egypt's inflation would be a sort of the combination of the sort of global rate, which we proxy by the American rate, plus sort of changes in the exchange rate. But it's not. It's lower. And so we'll argue that these are from some product market interventions. And so I'm going to go back to, let's see, right here. And so this is with equation 4. Here we try to isolate, and that's where we have the D1 plus N over 1 plus N component. So we're going to look at sort of what the inflation should have been if we didn't have these product market interventions. And there's a way, an innovative way we found to calculate this, because it's hard to know, but you can see in the report the appendix in the appendix of our chapter where we describe how this is done. And so then you can see that. So as I was saying before, that if you look on the right hand side of the equation 4, that sort of the inflation is a sort of function of the global price, which is the PT star. PT star inflation, so the global tradable prices plus the exchange rate. So that's what it should be in a way. And so that's we in the next slide we calculate that. And so here, this is what we're trying to estimate. What would have the inflation rate been? You know, under obviously it's a counterfactual with certain assumptions. If there weren't any product market interventions, subsidies, or price controls. And so if you recall that, focusing again on Egypt, it's easier because I'll just stick with one country, but you can see the effect with many countries. That so Egypt before had 14% average inflation in the second period after the start of the hostilities in Ukraine, and so that the period that we have there is from March to July. But if you remove, as we showed in equation 4 below, the part due to policy interventions, inflation would have actually been higher. We calculate it at 18.4%. And so we do that for all countries. And then if you focus on the chart on the right, you can see the calculations that we've done. And this is consistent with findings from the IMF as well. That pass-through in MENA countries is lower than other regions. And so there we have on the right here we have a listing of the effect of the percentage point sort of lower that inflation is in this plot here. You can see that actual inflation in Egypt was about 4.1% percentage points lower than what you would expect without policy interventions. And then so if I can move. So here we wanted to look what type of policy interventions, product market interventions, and so you can think of many different types. So increased food and fuel subsidies, new price controls, trade regulations, indirect tax exemptions, sort of VAT exemptions, product-specific exchange rates. So sort of if you want to import oil, you can use a different exchange rate, so it ends up making the price lower. And then also going in the opposite direction, some countries actually increased prices. Many of the oil importers did that because of strains on their budgets. And so here you can read more about this in the report. But we put a sort of categorize different each country. So here you have the list of the different regions I have mentioned, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, developing oil exporters, and developing oil importers, and the different policies they've taken, sort of the product market interventions they've made. And you can see many of the oil importers have intervened heavily, especially with increased food and fuel subsidies. Almost all of them, I guess, except Lebanon. And so you can see that also the count out of the total countries. We focused on the left that's the product market interventions. There's also different types of interventions, more targeted social protection. These are the three categories on the right. Some of them will also influence prices, but the mechanisms are sometimes a bit different. So I won't get into that here. We mentioned it in the report. But one to highlight is our cash transfers. So these are measures that target the most vulnerable. And in the next few slides, we'll show the difference between using a cash transfer, a targeted cash transfer to the poor versus a sort of fuel subsidy that everyone benefits, including the rich. Let's see if we have so we have the calculations here. If I could, so maybe I can explain a bit what we want to show is that this effect to bring the inflation rate down, say for Egypt from 18.4 to 14%, is not costless. The government has to provide these subsidies, and so there's a fiscal cost to lowering inflation. And we know that there are many reasons why, even in Western countries and also in Japan, the governments are trying to keep cost of living lower for their populations, for political reasons. So we understand the rationale, but it's costly. Every country, everywhere, and so, but obviously, countries like the GCC, who are receiving windfall profits from their hydrocarbon exports, can manage these extra costs. We've seen, like, for example, a new program in Saudi Arabia, which is of cash transfers, targeted cash transfers, that was rolled out a few months back. And this is something that's that Saudi Arabia can manage, because it's just increased, its revenues increased substantially. But focusing on here, what we wanted to see, if you remember, I'm just focusing again on Egypt. So if you recall, the price change that, so we estimate that the inflation in Egypt should have been around 18%, and instead it was 14%, the actual. So if you can think of, just assume that all of that gain was in food and energy prices. That was sort of like that the Egyptian government was able to implement this savings in inflation, this lowering of prices, by using product market interventions in food and energy. And so then that would be equivalent to lowering those prices by 9.4% percentage points. And this is a function of the total change, which is 4.1% of the total price level, and the amount of the sort of the weight of food and energy consumption in the basket, which is around, I think, around 45%. And so this allows us to do this analysis, and you can see the orange line there, the dotted orange line, is the sort of like we put the sort of we break the population of Egypt into by deciles of income, and we can show that so that you can imagine a sort of a compensation scheme that's targeted to certain deciles. So if you target with the orange, look at focusing on the orange curve. If you target just the poorest, the amount you have to pay is 0.1% of GDP. And then if you take the remember, this is households, so it's not population. So actually, because poorer households have higher family sizes, so actually the population is a little bit larger than So instead of 10%, it might be 11, 12, 13%. If you target the first and second deciles, then we calculate that in order to bring sort of prices down, you compensate households for this 9.4% increase in food and energy prices, you'd have to spend, looks like about 0.2%. It looks kind of like a straight line, but actually it's not. It kind of increases as you go up, because when you get to richer families, the actual, because the consumption is higher, the amount of fiscal resources needed to compensate them increases, and so there's a slight curve to this. The point we want to make is the blue line, and there we compare sort of, the idea is what it divides the total. So you see the 1.4. I'm not sure if I can see. It's 1 point, maybe 1.1 for sort of compensating the entire population. So you can think of that as like with a fuel subsidy, divided by just compensating the poorest decile. And so that would, that gives you, you can see that that ratio is 13.22 times. So it's 13.2 times more costly to compensate the entire population as opposed to compensating just the poorest decile. And that's the point we want to make for countries that, unlike Saudi Arabia or other Gulf countries that have windfall revenues. If with sort of oil imported countries that have, budget constraints that are binding, a decision needs to be made on how best to use the funding, the funds that they do have available. And we would argue that there's a strong case to be made to target the sort of support to the neediest. And you can see that that's a much more affordable way to sort of compensate and provide relief to households that are suffering. And we do the same calculations for West Bank and Gaza and Morocco. We get similar results, and you can see more of that in the report. I don't want to take up too much time, but if I can briefly mention, so on debt. So obviously, as I mentioned, the Gulf countries and oil exporters are doing better because of the crisis. So here we focus more on the oil importing countries that are faring worse. And as you can see, this graph shows the sort of debt levels for the different groups: the high income, which is the GCC, and the oil importers and the oil exporters. And you can see that focusing on the bars, the blue bars are MENA, and the yellow, the orange dots are for the world. And we can see, focusing on just on the oil importers, those are the ones in red. You can see that their levels of debt are much higher than the world, and they're much higher than the other countries in MENA. And so this is the sort of, it's increased. And so this is where we can see that you have debt vulnerabilities for these countries, and if they have to spend more to compensate households for the price increases that we just discussed, that's an extra expense. And so this is a sort of, just want to highlight the vulnerabilities to these oil importing countries. And here we kind of, wish this was a little bit bigger. Hopefully you can see it. That this is just a sort of back of the envelope calculation of the interest to revenue ratio. So the sort of debt affordability for oil importing countries. And we have a few here where we have plenty of data. And if I just wanted to highlight a few statistics. So here we show sort of the government revenues as a percent of GDP. You can see that they vary between 24% for Morocco, 25% Morocco, Jordan, Tunisia, similar percentages. Egypt a bit lower. And then with the debt levels, you can see that Morocco is around 70%, Jordan at 114, Egypt close to 92%, so higher than the world median average. You can see there, and the middle income average. Countries differ also in the sort of composition of debt. So you can see it's for Morocco, most of their debt is local currency debt, and that tends to be safer. less vulnerable to external events, as we showed in the beginning with the rise in interest rates. Whereas compared to sort of Jordan, which has no, excuse me, Tunisia, which has a higher rate of foreign currency debt as opposed to local currency debt. And then an important subcomponent of foreign currency debt, we highlight this more in the report, is market-based debt, bonds, loans, because many of these countries also have loans from JICA, say, from the World Bank, the multilateral loans that are sort of 40-year maturity, sometimes fixed rates, concessional terms. So in the calculations we did, we wanted to make sure we didn't include those types of loans. So we focused on the market based loans. And so you can see within the foreign currency debt, how much is market based. It's sort of bonds, and these are the ones that will move as the yields move, as I showed it earlier, as central banks raise interest rates. And you can see sort of like Jordan is somewhat on the higher end with 50%. Lebanon is not here; it's a much higher, almost above 90% of its debt is market based. Of its foreign currency debt is the market based. And we use that. We wanted to show here the change in domestic yields. So as I showed earlier, so you had the rising rates, interest rates from central bank tightening. And so the next column shows the sort of change in domestic yields, and then we have the change in foreign currency yields. And then from that we can able to calculate a change in interest payments, and then that divided by revenues. In the last, you can see on the far right, gives you a measure of debt affordability. So to take Egypt again, you can see that they have a high rate of interest payments to government revenues. So you can see half of their revenues has to go for interest payments. It's a huge amount, and also and we show that it's actually increasing for all countries. So with the change in the rates environments, that the sort of debt affordability is worsening, and we can see that in Morocco. So Morocco is a little bit. It already was lower, and the change isn't that much because most of their debt was domestic debt. But Tunisia, with a higher percentage of foreign currency debt, also sees its debt affordability statistic decline, and sort of some rating agencies put sort of interest payments to revenues threshold of around 25% as a sort of warning. Sort of above there, it's a low credit rating for countries if they have the interest payments above revenues above that mark. And that's just some caveats. And just to say thank you, sorry for taking a lot of time. Looking forward to the question and answer period. And here you can see the report is available here. Just click on this if you get the slides, and you can see more of the details of this analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ernesto, for your presentation about the first half of the report, which is about the regional economic outlook. We received the question from our viewers in advance, and also one question came in during your presentation. So let me read those questions, asking you and also Hoda to respond. First one, actually, this is a question that came in during the presentation, and we sort of take it granted as a World Bank suck, but I just wanted to read this because probably external audience may wonder about the production process of the very much the report of the very much complicated region. How do you produce the regional report? You mentioned country economists working on country economic outlook. How do you combine and compile the analysis? I'm just curious because the MENA has a variety of countries in different nature. This is a fair question. So I'd like to ask you to respond on this point. And then let me continue reading a question that we received in advance, which is this one. To consider future economic or financial strategy under the marketing uncertainty, what kind of options do you think MENA has rather than borrowing through market during the COVID-19 to protect people from the rise of prices? What kind of financial options does MENA countries have to ease the debt with the rising interest rates of bond and commercial debt? So this is a question that we received from our regular anonymous viewers. Thank you very much for your question. So I would like to ask Honest and Hoda to come in to response to those points raised by viewers. Thank you.
Okay, sure, thanks. Maybe I'll take the report. Actually, I'll take the first one because I think maybe Hoda might want to chime in on the second. I'll take the second one first, and then we can discuss the first one, which is more of a fun question. And then I'd ask also if Hoda had some of her experience as well. So let me inform. So it was the borrowing. So what can countries do in situations as we've highlighted. I mean the advice that we provide at the World Bank, we have several products. One is sort of the public financial review. It used to be called the public expenditure review, and during that exercise, country economists working with the government look for sort of savings that can be made in sort of in spending, in ways to increase revenues. So I would we would always advise that countries look within their sort of budgets to sort of how to more efficiently spend and how to perhaps increase revenues and perhaps if support to the poorest is needed through a cash transfer, then perhaps spending on other items can be decreased. And so what I'm getting at is ways to keep the deficit at a reasonable level, maybe a slight increase. I know many countries have increased deficits, but sort of work to manage the deficit so that doesn't increase too much, and then that will lower the need for borrowing. The second point would be, as many of your viewers would know, is to look for concessional financing. So to try to avoid commercial debt, which can be sort of high, the interest rate is higher. It could be at floating, rate terms, so disadvantaged terms. And so many organizations, the World Bank and others, the IMF, JICA, we offer, loans at concessional terms. And so we always encourage countries to, keep deficits low and look for concessional funding from multilateral and bilateral lenders. On the second question, the first question on the report, it's how to say, it's a 6-month process. We start early. This one was actually the one we were presenting now is very large. I just presented the first part. The second part has many chapters. Hoda was an author of one of the chapters. This brings together, I think, 13 chapters. It's 300 pages. Our reports are not normally that long, but it was intended as a compendium of different papers that the department has done. So this was a bit special. But normally we'll have sort of working on some research topics for a few months. I know Hoda is working on the next one. I will not be on. I'm not involved in the next one, but Hoda can talk more about the new MEU. And then so you had a specific question on growth estimates. So there we work with our country economist colleagues. So each country normally has 2 economists, one based in DC, one in the field, or sort of covering the country, and they're the ones that will work on developing a forecast, and we will take those forecasts and aggregate them into sort of sub-regional bundles, and so that's how we come together with a sort of the section that's on MENA growth. And then we also look at the news and to develop the sort of section on global trends. So the first section I discussed, we're just following current events and looking at other reports within the bank, the IMF, journalistic articles, and other reports from other donors. And then like we said, we have a special section that we usually develop in advance. So I would say the global trends, the sort of the MENA specific, where we take inputs from our country economists, and then we have a special topic. And I mean, so Hoda's just joined recently, so she worked on this one, and she's working on the next one. So I don't want to put her on the spot, but I don't know, Hoda, if you had any thoughts you'd like to share on the process so far that you.
I would just add that, like Ernest said, it's a 6 months process. So right now we're working on the next MENA economic update, which will be released in April 2023. Like Ernest said, the first part usually looks at the regional macroeconomic outlook. The second part is a thematic chapter, which for the April 2023 economic update will focus on food insecurity and the human capital effects of food insecurity. Thank you.
Thanks, Hoda. Yes, it's very exciting, very topical. Sort of what I'm looking forward to seeing what the team develops for the thematic chapter for the next one. Thanks, Kochi. Back to you.
Great. Thank you very much for responding the points that we received from our viewers. And Hoda, we are already looking for having you for the next round of the presentation in 6 months from now. But thank you very much for both of you. Once again, with us this morning, we had a pleasure of having Ernesto Segenti and also Hoda Asem from the Office of the Chief Economist for the North Africa and Middle East and North Africa region of the World Bank. Thank you very much for your time joining us this morning. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Kochi. Thanks to all your viewers also for their attention. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you very much. So we are going to follow our colleagues taking the Thanksgiving break next week. So there is no morning seminar out of our office next week, but we are going to be back in 2 weeks from now. We will be featuring the Poverty and Shared Prosperity 2022 report, which is like every 2 years published the almost the major regular report of what's going on in the poverty status, the major report by the World Bank. And also we are going to figuring out the specific date for Findex Data 2021 presentation around the first week of December. And then we are going to also have the face-to-face and hybrid seminar, 2 of them. One is December the 2nd. We will have Will Martin from IFPRI. While his visits to Tokyo, we are going to have a special research session featuring him. He's going to speak about the food price issues. And then we are going to feature Dorte Werner, who is from the Agricultural Global Practice, the lead economist, on December 8th. She's going to be visiting Japan, and she's going to discuss her report on insect farming as a potential source of the protein in Africa. So we have a lot of seminars coming up in December. Please stay tuned. Check our website for the most updated information. With that, have a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Thank you.